Hello and welcome to week 2 in database system. Jumping straight into our agenda, today we'll go over the assignments, and then in a separate lecture, I'll talk about chapters 3 and then chapters 5. I started splitting those out because they're quite long, and so to keep things relatively short, we'll talk about the assignments in this conversation first, and then we'll shift over and talk about the chapters in a separate conversation. Moving on to the assignments. So we are entering week 2. In week 2, you should be reading chapter 3, which centers on data modeling and using the ER, the entity relationship model. And then in chapter 5, you'll be talking about or reading about the relational data model and relational database constraints. For the discussion for this week, the first one centers on chapter 3, where you talk about data modeling and ER modeling, and then second discussion centers on chapter 5. Drilling into the objectives for this week, a lot of it does center on the text that we'll be talking about shortly. The ER modeling concepts have been very well adopted throughout the industry. They are a very pervasive model. They are if somebody is going to diagram and design a database, they are most likely going to be using ER modeling concepts unless they're doing something more interesting with different sorts of database technologies like NoSQL and so on. And to understand those, we also need to understand the concepts behind them. That's what chapter 5 centers on, which is relational modeling concepts and the constraints in relational database systems. Moving into the discussion, the first discussion, which centers on chapter 3, consider the ER diagram shown in figure 3.22 of your text. It's part of the bank database. Also shown in the side there for reference, each bank can have multiple branches, and each branch can have multiple accounts and loans. Those are many-to-many relationships. List the strong, non-weak entity types in the ER diagram. Is there a weak entity type? If so, give its name, its partial key, and its identifying relationship. What constraints do the partial key and the identifying relationships of the weak entity types specify in this diagram? And then list the names of all the relationship types and specify the min-max constraint of each participation of an entity type in the relationship type. That's something we call cardinality. Justify your choices. Moving into discussion 2, which centers on chapter 5. Discuss the characteristics of relations that make them make them different from ordinary tables and files. As always, do remember to respond to 2 of your classmates, doing so in a constructive way. Make sure that you do include citations in your initial post as well. And with that, I'll wrap up this kind of high-level introduction. I'll talk to you in a moment about the various chapters we'll be covering this week.